Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones, and this is Translation Notes, Mark 16, 1 through 4. We completed last week the pretty long chapter 15, hugely significant to Mark's narrative. And now we move into a much shorter chapter, especially if you take the shorter ending, which we'll talk about that, I think, next time. But this is the resurrection account, as Mark tells it. We're going to get about half of it today with Mark 16, 1 through 4. A little bit of housekeeping to get us set up. You ought to be able to see my screen and hear my voice now. There's also a chat feature. It's the questions box is what it's called. So if you click on that and go there, you can type a question and send it my way. It's a one-way typed chat, essentially, and I'll respond either individually or anonymize your comment and share with everyone. The handout that you see on the screen is also available at tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes. So if you're watching this later on a recording, it's there now. If you're having any trouble accessing this handout right now live, you can get it from that tiny URL, but it's also in the materials section of our GoTo training panel. If you've got any questions at all, at any time, you can type them into the chat and I'll respond as soon as possible, if not right away. Certainly, we'll stop along the way as we go through these different verses. All right, so we are at Mark 16:1, and if you'll give me just a moment, I want to get my pointer going here. All right, there we go. So Mark 16:1 is where we're going to start. And in case you haven't been to this series or haven't been in a while, the focus here is on the questions that come up when we translate the Greek into English. And the focus is more on that act, on that move from Greek to English. And then there are questions of translation and translation approach that come up, and we address those along the way. The focus is less on particular features in accordance. We have many webinars pre-recorded here. If you go to help and webinars, that's going to take you to this screen right here, accordancebible.com/webinars. Again, you can access that from the help menu, get right there to webinars, and that's got a lot of pre-recorded stuff. All of mine are in the Western Hemisphere category, including all of the Mark translation notes. So you can find those there, and I know those have been added to YouTube recently as well. There may be other platforms. And anything feature focused is going to be in the webinars too, under both hemispheres. We've covered a lot of ground over the years. All right, let's see if folks have any questions or comments to begin. Looks like we're all set, and we'll jump into the text itself. Here's Mark 16:1. And I'll read this in accordance. We'll start here. Kai dia genamenu tu sabatu, Maria he Magdalene, kai Maria he tu Iacobu, kai Salome, igorasan aromata, hina elthusai alepsosin autan. And we'll go left to right first, and then I'll show you my translation, and then we'll talk through the different parts of it. Diagenamenu, we've got this u here, tips us off that this is a genitive. And it also, we've got the genitive article here, and sabatu with the genitive ending here. So when we see u like this, it's a pretty good indication that we've got what's called the genitive absolute at the beginning. This clarifies something about the sentence, but grammatically it stands almost on its own. So we would translate this like, and the Sabbath having gone, or Sabbath had passed, and, or something like that. This word, diagenamenu, is a participle, aorist middle participle, neuter singular genitive. So we've got genitive, genitive, genitive. All right, so when the Sabbath had passed, Mary Magdalene and Mary of James, this is not Mary the daughter of James, but Mary the mother of James. We had that clarified in where she was first introduced in verse 40. So we have Maria, we have Mater there. So that's just kind of elided. It's left out here. Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. So that's the subject. They bought rather a gorasan, spices, or one commentary calls these aromatics, in order that they might anoint him, or in order that going they might anoint him. And we'll smooth that out in just a second here. I just want to point out this agorasan is from agorazo, and you may know this from English. If you talk about agoraphobia, that would be like a fear of like an open marketplace. It is kind of the image that comes to mind there. So that's hopefully an easy word to remember if you can tie it to something in a language you already know. Here's how I've translated it. Now, when the Sabbath had passed, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. We talked, or I mentioned that beginning genitive absolute, diagenamenu to sabatu. Of course, you've got the instant details if you need help with the parsing, but the oo there screams genitive to us. And when we see a genitive that early in the sentence, especially in Mark, we can have a pretty good hunch that it's a genitive absolute. And we confirm that by saying there's nothing else that this modifies. This doesn't go with any other part of the sentence. So we could translate that as when the Sabbath had passed, when the Sabbath was over. This may stand out to you, this dia here, which typically is glossed or translated as through. So you've got dia, and then genamenu is from genomai, which can mean happen or came to pass or occurred. So you could translate this any number of ways: when the Sabbath had passed, or when the Sabbath was over, when the Sabbath was completed. It's more literally, it's saying something like when the Sabbath had run its course, when it had gone through, when the hours of the day had passed through. That's the image we get with that verb. But no need to bring that out so explicitly. Mark is just saying Sabbath is over, and that tells us not only when we are in this section. And Mark 15 has had a number of temporal words, we may recall. It's also setting us up for the fact that now they can buy spices. The markets are back open. It's not against the observance of Sabbath now for them to buy spices and consider the work of anointing. So that is also not just locating us in time, but telling us now they can go buy spices to anoint him. Notice the compound subject. We've got Mary Magdalene and another Mary and Salome. So we have three subjects. You could see this visually in your diagrams tool. I'm going to add parallel diagram and 16:1 here. Now this is a little more convoluted looking than just three horizontal lines that are joined together. And that's because we have some essentially clarifying or modifying information about each of the three subjects. But at its simplest, we've got Maria, Kai Salome. But here, this Mary Magdalene, that's clarified, and then another Mary, Mary, the mother of James. And that's helpful because they're both named Mary. And so presumably that's why Mark gives us those descriptors. Salome is just Salome. That's the compound subject. So these are the actors here. They're familiar to us from the previous verse I mentioned where they were introduced, but also just the verse before. We have the same compound subject of the two Marys. Salome is not mentioned here, but she's probably there, we would think. I mean, she's there in the previous verse. What was that? Verse 42. I'm sorry, that was verse 40. So she's here in verse 40. She's in 16:1. Presumably she's in 47, but it's really a continuation of the narrative here, even though it's a new story, new paragraph, new scene, new time. But we're really just continuing here. So the subject, the actors, the focus of this passage initially are the three women. Now, pretty quickly, it's going to shift to Jesus, who is, of course, the main character in the resurrection story. But it begins by looking at them. And I noted, this is not a question of translation so much as just an observation. I noted last week how surprising this is to me as a reader of Mark. If I try to read it with fresh eyes, I have seen so many stories and interactions with the other disciples, folks like Peter or James and John and others. I might have expected to see them in a verse like this. Instead, Mark gives us three characters that he's just recently introduced. And so I just find that surprising. If I read it with fresh eyes, of course, I know this story, so it doesn't surprise me. But that's just an interesting thing that happens. That these people that haven't been in the narrative yet, they're the ones that are there. They're the ones that are there at the cross. They're the ones that are there at the tomb. But we could probably conclude some things. As a former friend and housemate of mine used to say, that'll preach. So you could think about ways that might preach. But we do know a little bit about them, because when Mark introduced them, he said he introduces them in verse 40, and then in verse 41, he gives them some detail who, when Jesus was in Galilee, followed him and supported him. So they are new to the narrative as Mark tells it, but they're not new to the actual historical story. I mean, he's in Jerusalem now, and we've had all this buildup for Holy Week, and this is when he was in Galilee, and they followed him and supported him, and there's this ongoing sense with these verbs. So they have, in fact, been with Jesus. Why Mark hasn't mentioned them in the narrative before, I couldn't tell you, but he does mention now that they have been with him. So these are new to the narrative, but they're not new people. They're not new followers. They've been with Jesus for some time that Mark doesn't clarify. So it's maybe not surprising. They had already followed him and supported him. It maybe in that sense, it's not so surprising that they would be here looking after Jesus again. That's how Max and Mary, in their grammatical analysis, that's how they read this diakoneo verb Mark had used of them in verse 41. So if they had been looking after Jesus in life, they certainly were looking after Jesus by being there at the cross. And now they're going to look after him again, caring for him, showing love, even though he's not alive now, by anointing him. They're going to honor him, bring some dignity there. In fact, Robert Gundry in his Mark commentary says the three women's buying aromatics, that's what he calls the spices, that they might go anoint Jesus, helps remove the disgrace of his crucifixion. Ordinarily, nobody would think to give a victim of crucifixion the dignity of an anointing. This is a unique case because as Mark tells it, and as Mark's readers read it, Jesus has been unjustly crucified. So there ought to be dignity. His dignity, they have attempted to strip his dignity from him, and we saw that all through verse 15 with the mocking and the accusations of blasphemy, and of course this death by torture. And so they are seeking to restore a level of dignity with the anointing here. And what Gundry says, maybe this feels like common sense to us because of what crucifixion is. It might be someone who folks all thought deserved capital punishment. Well, in fact, that's the case with Jesus, that many thought that, but then there's many followers who don't think that. So he gets his anointing. I'll just share one more part of this verb or of this sentence, and then we'll pause and see if you've got comments or questions. Why are they going to the tomb? Well, they're going to go and anoint him. Or actually, at this point, it's just they bought spices. So why did they buy spices? Hina elthusai lepsosin auton, in order that they might go and anoint him. We've seen this before in Mark, what's called the participle of attendant circumstance. That's where you've got a participle and a main verb, an indicative verb. Often the participle is an aorist participle, and the more wooden translation would be, in order that going, they might anoint him. And I suppose you could translate it that way, but the idea with the participle of attendant circumstance is that this participle here is not necessarily there to modify so much as just to carry the action forward. So even though you've got elthusai here, strictly speaking, grammatically, it's modifying this verb. You can translate them as two indicative verbs. So uh, I have so that they might go and anoint him. I did not include the definition to that in today's handout, but if you go to Wallace's Greek grammar, his definition is here. Action that in some sense is coordinate with the finite verb. So it's not dependent, even though it's dependent semantically. So that's why you see in the diagrams, this elthusai still modifies a leipsosine, or grammatically it's subordinate to it, but it is better understood as a finite verb. And he talks more about this and gives some examples of this, but I think that's what's happening here. So they bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. So I translate this as two indicative verbs. We've got a good setup now for what's going to surely be a good story. We readers know what apparently these three women don't know, which is that they're going to find a stone rolled across the tomb. We had that last week in our account of Joseph of Arimathea. We and they know what time it is. We and they know that he's dead. They saw the crucifixion for themselves, so they very much know what's going on. But this one element that we know as readers, or Mark has shown the readers, is as of yet unknown to them. They're going to go to the tomb, and then they'll ask each other, who will roll away for us the stone. Actually, I take that back. They may have known that. It all depends on how we translate this verb elegon. Let's come back to that in just a moment. Either way, it's a great suspenseful setup. We don't know if they know at this point. Let me put it that way. We don't know whether they know about the stone. And so it's kind of like that feeling you have if you're watching a movie and you know that there's a key piece of information that the main character doesn't have, and you almost worry for them. So we don't know whether they know about the stone and they're going to go and anoint him, and there's already some suspense and some potential conflict set up, which will very quickly be resolved, by the way, which is part of the miracle of this. But it doesn't start with the miracle. It starts with the setting, these characters, the women, and the purpose, which is to go and anoint Jesus. Let me pause there and see what questions you've got. And I'll share these anonymously in the chat so that you can see what I'm reading. Somebody says translating adverbial participles into verbs can lead to awkward meanings. Example 16:1, do they have one purpose or two purposes? Adverb, they bought spices so that they might come and they might anoint him. Existing adverbial, they bought spices so that after coming they might anoint him. Okay, point taken. Let's see what other questions or comments folks have. Oh yeah, someone notes here, I'll put this in the chat too. Verse 1, this is referring to this textual issue here with to, unnecessary insertion of to before James. Not all Greek New Testament proper name occurrences require an article. And that in brackets, of course, we see that's a textual issue, and we've got various resources that we could look at that. Metzger is one of them, text commentary. You could also open up a Greek New Testament that has an apparatus and see for yourself what some of the textual evidence is. There's a lot to decipher here. But it's rewarding once you know how to do it. And whether you remember all those symbols or not, folks like Metzger put it into prose for us. so that we can see exactly what the textual issues are. Thanks for those comments. Any other comments or questions on Mark 16:1 before we move ahead? On to verse 2. So this is moving the narrative forward. They have bought the spices and now they're going to the tomb. It hasn't resolved any suspense. It hasn't yet created the conflict in the women's eyes, although again, we know about the stone being there. But we'll go a little bit quicker on this verse. Kailian proi temia ton sabaton, erkontai epi ta mnemeon anatelantas to heliu. We'll go left to right, and exceedingly or very early, the first of the week, they went, or they are going, toward or to the tomb. And then we have u and u here. We have as, so just another declension, but still genitive. We have a genitive absolute again. The sun having risen. And we'll look at that in just a moment. But that's a genitive absolute again. And so this gives us, just like this other genitive absolute, this gives us information about the sentence. It is not, it is connected grammatically to the sentence, but there's also a sense in which it stands alone. That's the genitive absolute. And the absolute in genitive absolute means something like stands on its own. Here's how I translated it. And very early on the first day of the week at sunrise, they went to the tomb. I found this fascinating. This is one of those questions of translation. Yes, it has to do with Greek. It also has to do with your target language. Leon proi is early, Leon is exceedingly. And that time frame is further modified with the mention of sunrise. So very early at sunrise. The United Bible Society's Translator's Handbook says it is important that a translation of very early does not contradict the meaning of when the sun had risen. For in many languages, very early in the morning means well before sunrise. They're saying that if you translate this as very early, which is how I would tend to take Leon and proi. Proi is early, Leon is very. It isn't it's a modifying word. Mark could have just said proi. They're saying if you do that, which I've done, it's important that your readers, in other words, not see very early as a contradiction with sunrise, because in many languages, very early in the morning means well before sunrise. Now, this is cultural, but it's also cultural to you, like your own individual personal culture, because I imagine all of us wake up at different times in the morning, and what's late in the morning for one might be early in the morning for another, and vice versa. So the point here is just make sure this reads okay in translation. It's not saying cut very, but I suppose you could if you thought that very early was communicating like 4 o'clock and sunrise isn't till 6 o'clock or something like that. So I thought that was really interesting, and that's something I appreciate about these translators' handbooks is they have some sensitivity in terms of moving from one language to another. Of course, we're just going from Greek to English. English as spoken in the United States in 2026. That's where I'm coming from. So it's a specific move, but here they're talking about other languages as well. So I thought that was interesting and wanted to share that. Ton Sabbaton we might know as the Sabbath, but this is not the Sabbath because the Sabbath had just passed. We had to Sabbatu here, and we had dia from diaginomai. We had it had just gone through. The Sabbath was over, and we're moving forward in time. And so this is very early on the first day of the week. Sabbath can mean week. We could see that in BDAG. All of your translations will say that too. But if you click on, triple click on Sabbaton, it takes you in your default Greek lexicon to the word. So we've got here Sabbath, seventh day of the week in Israel's calendar. That's probably where my mind goes first, just because the English word Sabbath is so easy to see in that. But it can also mean a period of 7 days. And in fact, helpfully, BDAG puts Mark 16:2 here. In fact, they even say early on Sunday morning. Now, the word Sunday per se is not in the text, but if your readers are understanding Sunday as the first day of the week, and certainly in Christian tradition, thinking about Resurrection Day being a Sunday, I think that's a warranted translation. You may wish to take a more conservative or cautious approach, which I have, which is just the first day of the week. I think it was the UBS Translators Handbooks that said, if you translate it the first day of the week, be aware that there are cultures that reckon their calendars, the weeks as starting on Monday. So that could be confusing. So these are all the issues of translation that we want to think about. And so it may be clearer if this first day, and I've even among my own friends and family, we've had way too long conversations about whether we should think of Sunday or Monday as the first day of the week. I mean, that's really just a personal, do what you want with that, but maybe one's more European, one's more North American. At any rate, here, BDAG is saying Sunday just to kind of bring out with Sabbath being Saturday. Whether you think that's already clear to your readers or not is for you to decide. Point being, you've got a number of ways to translate this. What Mark wants to say is the Sabbath is over, and now it's the start of a new week. Temia here is in the feminine. I'll just show that in the instant details. So we've got the feminine definite article te, and we've got mia, this adjective, feminine singular dative. And we would expect a feminine word here that this modifies. Let me see if we can find this in the diagrams. You would expect this to be modifying a feminine noun. And in fact, it does. Hemera is day. That's feminine. So we've got that. That's why the first is feminine here, but it's not listed here. And Greek can leave words out more than English can, but in fact, in this case, we can do this too. You could say, I've put the word day in here, but if you wanted to be a little bit stricter with going word to word, you could say, and very early on the first of the week. And that would bring the Greek right over into English. And then again, just for you to decide, is this clear as a translation in the way that it would have been clear to the first readers? So the word day is not in there, but it is feminine. That's why temia is feminine. Very early on the first day of the week at sunrise, they went to the tomb. And I'll just note here again, this genitive absolute, when the sun had risen, at sunrise. The difference in translation here is that when the sun had risen retains this verb anatelantas and has a verb in English. So if that's important, you could do that. At sunrise, I think is saying exactly the same thing. And then just to note that erkontai is this so-called historical present. So they went to the tomb, but they go to the tomb. And here it is, present middle indicative, third person plural. So that's putting us right there in the action. Before we had a subjunctive because this is what they're about to do. But here we've got the indicative, the present indicative, because now Mark is zooming in on them and their current action and what's about to be the main narrative, which is what happens when they go to the tomb. Very early on the first day of the week at sunrise, they went to the tomb. We'll move on to verse 3 in a moment, but let me see what questions or comments you've got on verse 2 before we move on. Oh, great. Here's a good comment, and I appreciate this. I'll put this in the chat. Someone says, this is the only occurrence in the Septuagint and Greek New Testament of Leon with proi, and Leon could be translated as especially. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, this, as you're kind of making your way through this question, which I think this UBS Translators Handbook just summarizes what the issue is so well. And what I like about them and their approach is that they'll give you a good translation, but they'll honor the translator as the translator and recognize you've got a decision to make on which way to go here. So they kind of frame it in a way that you can decide. But yeah, part of that process might be searching for this throughout the Greek New Testament, and we just see it once, and then you can just do your drop down menu here and search in the Septuagint, and seeing the same thing that that comment just had, that is not there. So the downside to that is that you don't have other occurrences to use to compare this to. But I think because Mark tells us this information about the sunrise, I mean, I think we don't want to leave that out. That's there. So I think we just translate it in a way that makes sense. And again, realize that even if a particular country or region thinks of early in a certain way, this is so different person to person that I appreciate this caution from UBS, but I would have no trouble just leaving it this way, very early on the first day of the week at sunrise. But yeah, we do not have other uses. Thank you for pointing that out, to compare this to. Like, did the ancients talk about before sunrise is very early? Did they talk about sunrise is very early? It may be in other literature, but it's not in the Greek New Testament, the Septuagint. Great comment. Well, here's where some of the drama comes in. That's at verse 3. Let me just check in on questions. All right, I'll put this in the chat. Somebody notes that anatelantas to Eliu is an aorist participle. It is not an aorist indicative verb to translate a past tense event. The emphasis is on the meaning, circumstance of rising, not the event of sunrise. This would also be questions like this too are good time to check and see how different translations render it. You'll get when the sun was risen, just after sunrise. That's interesting. After sunrise, not at. Very early in the morning on the first day of the week, at sunrise, when the sun had risen. Yeah, I think you'll see some variation, but in all of them, the idea will be either that it's risen already, or if you say at sunrise, maybe as the sun is rising. You could go that way to the point of the comment. All right, great. Let's go to verse 3. I'll go back to accordance for that. And we'll just look at verse 3. Kai elegan pros heautas tis apokulise humin ton lithon ektesturas tu mnemeu. And they were saying to each other, or to one another, who will roll away? We've got a present present active indicative verb there. Who will roll away humin for us, ton lithon, the stone, ek from, testuras, the entrance, to mnemeu, from the entrance of the tomb. Pretty straightforward. Not even a whole lot of word order adjustment needed here. They had been asking each other, who will roll away for us the stone from the entrance of the tomb? I'm understanding Kai is pleonastic or untranslated here. It could be and. I have it, I try to preserve the Greek word order. So who will roll away for us the stone from the entrance to the tomb? I think that's okay. It may sound a little clunky. And if that's the case, you could do what a lot of translations do, which is who will roll the stone away for us, or who will roll away the stone for us. Here we have the indirect object in the dative, followed by the direct object in the accusative. Typically in English, we prefer, just for reasons of style, we prefer the direct object to come before the indirect object. So it would be considered more natural English, and by whose opinions, by whose standards, that's a whole other question. But you might have readers more expecting who will roll the stone away for us? So I will just acknowledge that I preserve the Greek word order there in my translation, but that may not be the most natural way to do it. And this is why. It's because typically we're used to the direct object coming first. Now, you may have gotten this without the grammatical language, just by feel. You may have heard me say this and think, well, that sounds awkward. And again, here's why. And if that's the case, who will roll the stone away for us may be the way to go. I'm curious about this elegon here. The imperfect verb can function in a number of different ways. And I've mentioned Wallace's Greek grammar. If we go back here and find, I mean, he admittedly, well, by my admission and other grammarians' admissions, he has a lot of categories in here. But for the imperfect, he's got, and I'm just scanning through these, pluperfective imperfect, conative imperfect. So that's like they wanted to, or they were trying to. Imperfect retained in indirect discourse. And I don't know why. Here, let me go back up. Customary, so habitual, it was their habit to, or they always did. Iterative imperfect, repeated, like they were doing it multiple times. Ingressive, they began to, and we've seen most, if not all of these in Mark. Progressive imperfect, instantaneous. All right, so he's got a lot of ways that the imperfect can be used. And I raise this just to say that elegon is from Lego, and it's imperfect. I think the first semester Greek way we would learn to translate the imperfect is were verb ing. So whatever the verb is. So they were saying to each other. And it may be that you do that and call it a day, and that's your translation, and that may be fine. The question is, what is the imperfect? How is it functioning here? If it's background information, it can be they had been asking. So like a past past tense had in English, they had been asking each other, and it's background information. And in that case, they were asking it already before they went to the tomb. Maybe they're already at the tomb here, but it's possible Mark is saying all along the way they had been asking each other, who will roll away for us the stone? Now, that may be implausible if we think they don't know that there's a stone there. So you could also translate it as they kept asking each other. That's iterative. They were asking each other over and over again. Again, the NASB just keeps it simple. They were saying to one another, and you may wish to do that too. So it could be background. It could be this. They were asking each other over and over. If you think it's background, you would maybe bring that out as had been asking. If you thought it was iterative, maybe they kept asking. In the end, maybe the safest move is to just do they were saying to one another, and acknowledge in English that that has some unpacking or some interpretation left for the reader, just like Mark has left for us to do in Greek. So maybe you do that if it's clear in the context. If it's not, you can do something like they were saying to one another. We have seen this stone and why it's there. Joseph of Arimathea had rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. The language is quite similar. We've got lithon here. We've got lithon. We've got teintheuron, teisthuros, to mnemeu, to mnemeu. So this rings a bell for the readers. Just a few verses ago, they know that Joseph rolled the stone, or if he didn't roll it himself, he had it rolled against the entrance of the tomb. So this is the potential conflict. For whatever reason, they are not thinking of themselves as the ones that can roll away the tomb. Now, this is just some speculation on my part, but it's hard to see Joseph himself rolling the stone. You know, that I imagine he had help, but if he did it by himself, he's got to be really strong that three women think that their strength can't equal his. That would just be very surprising to me that they could not, you know, if one of Joseph could do it, surely three of them could do it. But regardless, that's all speculation. And for them, this is an obstacle. So this is the conflict that's set up, not to mention the tension of behind this tomb is a dead Jesus who is not supposed to be dead, according to some of the expectations that he himself had set based on how he talked about himself in Mark. So This verse, I think, is pretty full of tension. Now, it's not going to be, it's not going to take very long to resolve, because next verse the stone is gone. But I just wonder if this elegon isn't iterative, like they had been asking over and over, that they're worried at this point. Again, Mark doesn't give us that level of detail. We don't get an inside look into their thought process or how they're feeling. But as I read it, I don't imagine this as just a disaffected asking, oh, we need someone to roll away the tomb. I imagine some level of frustration and or despair here. Mark doesn't tell us about them grieving, but they are anointing a dead body. And so that typically has grieving with it. So anyway, I think there's a lot in this question. Not that that comes out in translation. But they need the stone rolled away. And the question again, why? Why do they need the stone rolled away? In verse 1, the whole reason they're buying the spices is to go and anoint him. And now they're going to the tomb to anoint him. And now they need the stone rolled away so that they can anoint him. We can read ahead in the story if we're curious and say, do these women ever get to anoint Jesus? Well, in fact, no, because he's not there anymore. That's the exciting part of the story that we'll come to next time. But for now, they need someone to roll the stone away, or they think they do. The stone is still there. This is tightly connected to how Joseph had left the scene. He had rolled the stone against the entrance of the tomb. I'm sorry that that says bomb. That is a pretty big typo. I will fix that. Make sure you get the corrected version in your email, and by the time you go to the tiny URL, that will be corrected. So roll the stone against the entrance of the tomb. They need that moved so they can do what they've come to do, which is to anoint the body and restore some dignity. And that's probably important to them too, not just as an act of love for Jesus and an act of service, which we know they've already done. I would think it's also an important part for them of the mourning process. So we have one more verse to do, but let's pause and see what this brings up for you. Questions or comments, especially if you haven't asked a question or made a comment. I would invite your participation, but I'll respond to all of these. And I'll put them in the chat. Somebody says, from parallels, we know Nicodemus was with Joseph, and I doubt he would not have just jumped in to help, as it was late and neither wanted to work on the Sabbath and be home, as walking that distance might be work. Yeah, again, I don't know how strong these women are or how strong Joseph is, but it's just difficult to imagine that they could not do what he alone could do. So with the thought of Nicodemus there, I mean, that certainly makes sense. And I don't think we did a whole lot of research on what kind of stone would be required. But the idea is that somebody can't come and get the body. So it's got to be huge. It's got to be massive. It truly needs to be an obstacle. I mean, it's not just a decoration. And in fact, the women are experiencing it as a potential obstacle here. Yeah, here's a similar comment. Let me put this in the chat. Somebody says, Joseph of Arimathea plus Nicodemus plus servants who helped lower Jesus from the cross. So several men probably rolled stone onto the tomb entrance. Great, thank you. Yeah, and also that means that, if there were any desire to take the body out or just to go in, I mean, that requires multiple people, which is going to be conspicuous. Let me catch up on these other comments. Oh, great. This is helpful to know. Thank you for doing this search. Somebody points out Mark is the gospel writer with the most frequent genitive absolutes. 2 are in verse 16, 1 total hits per 1,000 words. Yeah, just a little bit more than Matthew in terms of frequency, just barely. Great. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's the nice thing about going through a book this slowly is you realize after 3 or 4 or 5 of these things, especially if you have to look up the grammatical category, you get a sense of like, yeah, this guy does this a lot, like that so-called historical present, or in this case, the genitive absolute. All right, let's see what other comments and questions you have. I'll put this in the chat and we'll move to the last verse. Somebody says, entertaining that the women were saying in the imperfect tense, saying more than twice to each other. Who? Yeah, that's the sense I get. And it would be. I mean, if it weren't so tragic, it would almost be comical. There certainly is this sense of absurdity here, that they're all ready to go, and they've got this huge stone in the way. So anyway, that we don't need to sit too long with that tension, because Mark doesn't. Mark resolves it right away. And this is the miracle. I mean, the miracle of the resurrection. There's a lot we could say about it, but one aspect of the miracle is the suddenness of it. Because they don't have, I mean, we don't know how long they're sitting in this moment, how many times they've asked each other, how long that lasts. In terms of the narrative, it's very short, because right away now in verse 4, kai anablepsasai theorusin hati apo kekulistai halithas in gar megas sphadra. This is where we'll stop today, because there's a new paragraph here, and next time we'll get the actual interaction with Jesus, which of course is who the resurrection is about. But let's do this left to right. And so here's a participle. And looking up, they saw, or they are seeing. We have this present tense here again. Mark is making sure we're right there in the narrative. And looking up, they see that the stone had been rolled away. Perfect. So it's done. It's not like the stone was ajar or partway removed. It's complete. It's finished. So they're all set now with that piece. And then we get this interesting in gar megas sphadra. Gar is post positive, so that means it's if positive is first position, post positive is second position. Typically the word for here in English, that comes first, so we just move that over here. For it was very, very big. Sphadra is very, an intensifying word, an adverb, and megas is big or large. We're going to come back to that, why that sentence is there and what it's doing. But I just note here, Kai, we've got 4 verses today, all of which begin with Kai. And I've translated them 4 different ways, not on purpose, but I thought the Kai in Mark 16:1, because it begins a scene, I thought the word now would make sense. I thought and here for verse 2, since it connects to verse 1. I thought for verse 3, I just left it pleonastic. But you could do and there. But here I think it's best translated as but, because it's a contrast to their question. Who's going to roll away the stone? But it's already gone. Theorusin again in the present tense, as I noted. Megas sphadra, very large, huge, gigantic. This is going to come down to who's your audience, or what kind of translation approach. I mean, if you're trying to be more vivid with some of the wording, very large communicates very large. But if you wanted to use a more, I don't know, colloquial word like huge or gigantic, that certainly would be appropriate, because the sphadra here is saying it's not just big, it's really big, it's enormous, it's huge. That's why they were asking themselves, who's going to roll it away? All right, so this last phrase here, which is where we wrap up today, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. I find this interesting. I think gar, I think of that as meaning for, and it's a grounding. It introduces a grounding clause. X happened because Y was true. For Y was true, and even that use of for might be considered a little bit more archaic. I think we're more likely to see the word because or since now. And you can still use for here, because it means, I think, not necessarily grounding, but BDAG lists this meaning for gar of, it's a marker of clarification, for in the sense of you see, and it lists this use as an example. So you could read this as, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. Or they saw that the stone had been rolled away, you see it was very large. So the gar here isn't grounding this clause, which makes sense, because to me, it does not make sense to say they saw that the stone had been rolled away because the stone was very large. That almost sounds like an example sentence you're given to correct in an English class, Because, well, what does that have to do with it? Why had it been rolled away on account of its being large? That doesn't make sense. So I don't think gar can have its typical grounding meaning here. Following a couple of translations, I read it as even though, but I thought this was interesting in BDAG, and I bet you, I didn't check this, but it's a safe bet that the ASV and the King James, yeah, they give 4. It was exceeding great. We get an M dash here in the ESV. King James is going to give us 4. It was very great. And again, that use of 4 is not the grounding 4, not because, it's the 4 as in UC. So I found BDAG really helpful here. However, that may not be what it means. Here's what the SIL exegetical summary series says. It asks the question, what is the function of the final clause in verse 4? Because it was very large. And that's a gloss. Again, gar, typically because. They give 2 options. One is it means because and explains the reason for something. I am not sure I go with this, but you may find it compelling. I may change my mind, but the reasoning here is this clause explains why the women had been concerned earlier about rolling the stone aside. And when translated, they had been alarmed about the stone, for it was very large. If that's the case, it's possible that this is modifying or going with the previous verse. And if you read it that way, you would maybe excuse me, consider just an adjustment of word order. So the idea here could be they had been asking each other, who will roll away for us the stone from the entrance of the tomb? For the stone was very large. But looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away. So the idea here is that, just imagine a big left parenthesis around this and a big right parenthesis around this. And this phrase is modifying all of this, not the preceding clause. That's one read of it. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not sure that's what's going on. We have some other possibilities. This assumes that they were still some distance away when they looked up. And the reason they could already see that the stone had been rolled away was because of the stone's large size. That's another reading. So in this reading, they looked up and they saw that the stone had been rolled away, even though they were far away. Because it was very big, they could still see it. That's probably a lot to put into English. And then the other option here, which to me is the simplest explanation, whether that's the best one or not is another question. But here it's saying the conjunction gar simply makes an additional comment about the size of the stone. And it was a huge stone. It was a very large stone, big or huge as it was. So I guess the first question is this like a grounding word, like a cause and effect? Is because the way to translate it? And if the answer is yes, I would tend to think this option is the way to go. Understand this as going back to their concern about moving it. But it's also possible that gar does not mean its typical grounding. It's just a marker of clarification. And in fact, BDAG says that. What we might want to do, we can just say we trust BDAG, or we can say, well, I want to see that for myself. In that case, what we might need to do is look at other uses of this. Let's see if that entry has it. Yeah, actually it does. It has some other uses. So you could go and look at these. This is really nice too that these are cataloged here, because if you just search for gar, and if you wanted to examine all the uses, that's 990 times in the Greek New Testament. But I would start with these. And this may be more than you want to do for one word. Maybe this just doesn't feel significant in translation. But if I was a little hung up on gar as because, and so this is helpful to see that it could have this meaning. And then you could just go even in Mark and look at these other passages. In fact, here's one, Mark 1:16. He saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. So that gar, according to BDAG, is clarifying there. Now, you may disagree. Maybe it's they were casting their net into the sea because they were fishermen, and that's what fishermen do. But that could be worth looking at those other options there. All right, so regardless of how we translate this gar, the last word moving into what's going to happen next is very big. So there's still this idea of just a massive obstacle, but now it's been removed. And so the next thing is esel thusai es ta mnemeon adon. So in going into the tomb, they saw, and then we get another character here, and we'll leave off there and finish this passage next time. But it's an interesting setup, I think, to what's an amazing account. It's also amazing to me that Mark tells one of the most significant passages theologically for the whole of the Christian faith in just these 4 verses. That's pretty remarkable to me as well. So I did want to spend a little bit of time with this setup. And I think as we go between the first 4 and second 4 verses of this passage, we can just ask, what light does this setup shed on what's here? I think, among other things, it does show us that here are some loving, caring women doing what they always did, which is to look after Jesus. They're there, they're showing up for him. There's a huge obstacle, a literal obstacle. They're identifying it, and now the obstacle is removed. And so the rest of this passage is going to go pretty quick here, and we'll do it next time. But I would love to hear from you, comments, questions on this verse or anything else on the passage. And then we'll stop maybe just a minute or two early. I'll put this comment in the chat. Somebody says, reflecting again on the women coming to the tomb after Sabbath, especially early, they both dressed and bought aromatics to go to the tomb, rushed to the tomb without thinking of access. While rushing, they were repeatedly asking each other who will move the stone, never thought to go back and request help from men. So myopic that they need to look up as they arrived at the tomb. Yeah, and myopic in the sense of they're not looking up here, right? So that's kind of interesting. And we could read that's. I'm glad you pointed that out, because we could read that as their eyes were downcast and therefore they actually are sad. That could be Mark's way, physically of telling us that they're sad. Yeah, thank you for sharing those reflections. Oh yeah, here's a good comment. Somebody says, let me just put this in the. Sorry, hang on, find the chat. Somebody says it may be the shopping for spices had gone faster and now arriving so early, they wonder who would be there to help them. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and there's not to pontificate too much, but there's a really interesting. I mean, Mark gives us a lot to think about here, and we especially see this with the ending. If we take verse 8 as the ending that Mark intended, but there's a lot about who's here and who isn't. That's just worth thinking about. Again, with the expected characters, or at least the characters who have taken up so many of Mark's words, are not here. Peter will be mentioned and his disciples, but there's not any interaction with Jesus and those other disciples. I mean, these are rightly considered disciples of Jesus, if not part of the 12. But there's no interaction with the 12. So anyway, there's just a lot here, and for 2,000 years, folks have wondered about this, and it's just really interesting to think about. Not to mention this ending in verse 8, which we can. It's one of those verses that I think may be easy to translate, a little bit harder to understand. All right. Oh, somebody says got to go. Thank you so much. Great. Okay, yeah, let's wrap up. Thanks for these comments and questions. They're great. Next time, we will wrap up this section. I'm going to end the recording now, but I'll stay on for just a moment for those of you who are here live. If you're watching the recording, reminder, tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes has the handout. By the time you click on this, you will see a corrected version of this handout. You can also email me at abramkj@accordancebible.com.